A young college student left her apartment for a short bicycle ride and never returned. Within hours, concern turned into alarm, and within days, a discovery along a Phoenix canal forced investigators to confront something violent and deliberate. The crime scene did not offer immediate answers, and early reporting revealed how limited the evidence appeared at first glance. What began as a missing person concern quickly shifted into a major investigation that would remain unresolved for years. If you appreciate careful, fact-based reporting that follows evidence instead of rumor, consider subscribing so more long-form investigations like this can continue. In November 1992, Angela Brosso, 22, was living in Phoenix while attending school. On the evening of November 8th, she left her apartment to ride her bicycle along a canal path near her home. When she did not return, those close to her reported her missing. The following day, her body was found near a canal in North Phoenix. Law enforcement secured the area and began documenting physical evidence. Investigators determined that she had been sexually assaulted. The injuries were severe, and authorities confirmed that the death was the result of intentional violence. The condition of the body indicated deliberate action rather than random accident. Detectives immediately began canvassing the surrounding neighborhoods and canal paths for witnesses who may have seen activity during the night. The canal system in Phoenix presented investigative challenges. It provided access routes that allowed individuals to travel through residential areas without attracting attention. Officers reviewed reports of suspicious activity, questioned residents, and examined any available physical traces left at the scene. Evidence was collected according to procedure and preserved for laboratory examination. At the time, DNA testing existed but was not as advanced or widely applied as it would later become. Biological samples were collected, but comparison databases were limited. Investigators relied heavily on interviews, geographic analysis, and physical evidence examination. The bicycle was recovered, and detectives attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events between her departure and the discovery of her body. Public concern grew quickly. The killing of a young woman near a commonly used recreational path raised questions about safety. Media coverage focused on confirmed details, including the location, timing, and law enforcement appeals for information. Police urged anyone who had used the canal path that evening to come forward with even minor observations. Despite sustained effort, no suspect was identified during the initial phase of investigation. Leads were pursued and evaluated, yet none produced sufficient evidence to support charges. Detectives documented findings carefully and maintained the integrity of collected materials. The seriousness of the crime required continued review even when immediate answers were not available. The absence of resolution did not reduce the importance of preservation. Physical evidence was stored, reports were archived, and the file remained open. The early work created a foundation that could be revisited if new technology or information emerged. While the public focus shifted over time, law enforcement retained responsibility for keeping the investigation active within departmental records. Angela Brosso's death marked the beginning of what would later be understood as a larger investigative challenge. At the time, however, officers were focused on a single violent crime, a young victim, and the unanswered question of who was responsible. The canal path that had seemed routine became the center of an unresolved inquiry that would extend far beyond 1992. After the discovery near the canal, Phoenix police moved from search to structured investigation. Detectives assigned to violent crimes began organizing witness statements, laboratory submissions, and neighborhood canvassing results. The urgency was clear, yet the available tools reflected the early 1990s rather than the technology known today. Officers retraced Angela Brosso's last known movements. They confirmed that she left her apartment on the evening of November 8th for a bicycle ride along the canal path. Friends and neighbors were interviewed. Detectives mapped the route she was likely to have taken and examined lighting conditions, access points, and possible areas where an encounter could have occurred. The canal system created long stretches without direct surveillance, which limited the ability to identify precise locations of contact. Physical evidence collected at the scene was processed and submitted for forensic examination. Biological material was documented and preserved. At that time, DNA profiling was developing, but comparison databases were not expansive. Investigators could test samples, yet the ability to match an unknown profile to a specific individual required either a direct suspect sample or an entry in a limited system. Without a named person for comparison, laboratory findings could confirm biological presence but not identity. Detectives pursued leads generated by tips from the public. Reports of suspicious vehicles, unfamiliar individuals, and prior disturbances along the canal were evaluated. Each lead required verification. Officers examined criminal records of individuals known to frequent the area. Registered offenders and those previously arrested for violent conduct were reviewed as potential suspects. Interviews were conducted and alibis were assessed. Despite these efforts, no arrest followed. Evidence did not point clearly to a single individual. The brutality of the attack intensified investigative pressure, yet officials avoided premature conclusions. Media coverage highlighted the seriousness of the crime and the ongoing search for information. Public fear grew, especially among residents who used canal paths for recreation or commuting. The investigation required coordination between patrol officers, detectives, forensic technicians, and prosecutors. Prosecutors reviewed evidence to determine whether probable cause could be established against any person of interest. At that stage, the threshold was not met. Without stronger physical linkage, charges could not be filed. Time also introduced challenges. Memories faded. Potential witnesses who had been near the canal on the evening in question could not always recall specific details. Environmental exposure affected certain forms of trace evidence. Investigators documented what they could and preserved remaining material under controlled conditions to prevent degradation. Attention to geographic patterns began to emerge. Detectives examined whether similar assaults had occurred in the region. Analysts compared details such as method, location, and victim profile to other unsolved crimes. At that time, no confirmed connection had been established, but awareness of potential patterns influenced how evidence was cataloged. Internal reviews ensured that procedural standards were met. Supervisors evaluated progress and authorized continued allocation of resources. Even without an immediate suspect, the file remained active. Detectives revisited witness lists and cross-checked tips against emerging information. The absence of a quick resolution did not signal abandonment. It reflected the boundaries of science and available data. Biological samples were retained. Reports were archived with care. Law enforcement understood that technological advances might one day offer additional clarity. By the end of 1992, the investigation had produced extensive documentation, yet no arrest. Angela Brosso's killing remained unsolved, and uncertainty continued within the community. What officers preserved during those early months would later become central, but at the time, the path forward appeared limited by the tools of the era rather than lack of effort. Less than a year after Angela Brosso was killed, another young woman disappeared near a Phoenix canal. The similarity in location would soon force investigators to consider whether they were facing more than an isolated act. What had once appeared to be a single, unresolved killing began to take on broader significance as new facts emerged in the fall of 1993. On September 21, 1993, Melanie Bernas, 17, left her home in North Phoenix. She rode her bicycle toward a convenience store. When she did not return, concern developed quickly. Family members reported her missing. Within days, her body was discovered near a canal, not far from where Angela Brosso had been found the previous year. Law enforcement responded with immediate recognition of the geographic overlap. Detectives secured the scene and began documentation. As with the earlier investigation, physical evidence was collected, photographed, and preserved. Medical examination determined that Melanie Bernas had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The circumstances showed deliberate violence. Investigators compared the details from 1992 and 1993 carefully. Both victims were young women riding bicycles near canal paths in North Phoenix. Both were assaulted and left near similar terrain. The proximity of locations and parallels in method could not be ignored. Detectives began formal review of whether a single offender might be responsible. The connection required careful handling. Authorities avoided premature public declarations while internally evaluating similarities. Forensic technicians examined biological samples from both scenes. At that time, DNA comparison between the two incidents could confirm whether the same individual left material at each location. Early testing indicated linkage, strengthening the theory of a common perpetrator. The emergence of a potential serial offender changed investigative posture. Additional resources were allocated. Detectives expanded canvassing efforts in neighborhoods adjacent to canal routes. Officers increased patrol presence along paths that residents used for recreation. Public advisories were issued urging caution, particularly for women traveling alone. Media coverage intensified. The repetition of violent assault near canals created fear across Phoenix. Families living near the waterway system expressed concern about safety. Officials emphasized that they were pursuing every lead while avoiding speculation about the identity of a suspect. Evidence preservation became even more critical. Biological samples from both crime scenes were retained under controlled conditions. Laboratory personnel maintained documentation to ensure integrity for future comparison. Investigators recognized that even if immediate identification was not possible, retained material might yield answers as technology advanced. The pattern analysis extended beyond Phoenix. Detectives reviewed unsolved crimes in other jurisdictions that involved canal areas or similar methods. Coordination with state and federal agencies expanded the scope of inquiry. Records were exchanged to determine whether the offender might have operated elsewhere. Despite intensified efforts, no arrest occurred in 1993. Leads were pursued and evaluated, but none provided sufficient evidence to support charges. The similarities between the two killings confirmed a pattern, yet the identity of the responsible individual remained unknown. The designation of what media began calling the canal murders reflected both location and investigative challenge. Within law enforcement, however, the focus remained procedural rather than descriptive. Detectives continued interviews, reviewed suspect lists, and revisited earlier tips from the Brosso investigation in light of new information. Community impact deepened as residents recognized that the earlier killing had not been an isolated act. The presence of a likely repeat offender created anxiety and pressure for resolution. Authorities balanced transparency with caution, sharing confirmed facts while protecting investigative strategy. By the end of 1993, Phoenix police were confronting two linked murders separated by less than a year. The evidence suggested consistency in approach, but the available tools limited immediate identification. The investigation now carried dual responsibility: accountability for two young lives and the need to prevent further violence. What had begun as a single unresolved crime had evolved into a larger and more complex inquiry. Detectives continued their work within the boundaries of science and evidence, aware that the answers might depend not only on persistence, but on advancements that had not yet arrived. By late 1993, investigators were no longer examining two separate killings. Evidence indicated that Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas had been attacked under circumstances too similar to dismiss as coincidence. Detectives shifted focus toward behavioral comparison, geographic study, and forensic linkage rather than treating each file in isolation. Both victims had been riding bicycles along canal routes in North Phoenix. Both were young women traveling alone during evening hours. Each was sexually assaulted and left near the canal system. Medical findings and laboratory testing supported the conclusion that the same individual was responsible. DNA analysis available at the time allowed comparison between the biological material recovered from both scenes. That comparison indicated a match, confirming a single offender. With that conclusion, Phoenix police organized the investigation around a serial predator operating in a defined area. Detectives analyzed the canal system as a network rather than a series of isolated paths. The waterways cut through residential neighborhoods, providing long stretches without lighting or surveillance. Access roads allowed entry and exit without attracting attention. The terrain offered concealment, yet remained close to populated communities. Officers examined maps and reconstructed likely routes used by the perpetrator. They considered where an encounter could occur without interruption and where a vehicle could be parked discreetly. Geographic profiling became part of investigative planning. Analysts studied patterns in the timing of the attacks, distances between scenes, and possible anchor points where a suspect might live or work. Public communication changed in tone. Authorities warned residents about using canal paths alone after dark. Patrol presence increased in affected neighborhoods. Community meetings addressed safety concerns. Officials emphasized that 2 killings were connected and that investigative resources had expanded. Detectives reviewed known offenders who resided within proximity of the canals. Individuals with prior sexual assault convictions or violent histories were evaluated. Background checks were conducted and interviews were performed where appropriate. DNA samples from persons of interest could only be obtained through legal process or voluntary submission. Without a clear suspect, collection remained limited. The linkage also required coordination with state databases. As DNA systems evolved, profiles were entered into available registers. At the time, those databases were not as comprehensive as they would later become. Nevertheless, the biological profile from the canal murders was preserved and cataloged for potential future matches. Investigators also revisited earlier tips received after Angela Brosso's killing. Statements that had seemed unrelated were re-examined under the assumption of a repeat offender. Officers cross-referenced names, vehicles, and reported sightings against new information gathered in 1993. Despite focused analysis, the offender remained unidentified. The confirmation of a single perpetrator narrowed investigative direction but did not produce immediate resolution. Leads continued to arrive, yet none resulted in charges. The canal system remains central to planning. Detectives assessed whether additional patrol coverage or lighting improvements might reduce risk. City officials evaluated safety measures, though law enforcement stressed that identifying the individual responsible remained the primary objective. The recognition of pattern transformed investigative structure. Files were consolidated, inventories were reviewed jointly, and forensic documentation was compared line by line. The confirmation of DNA linkage established scientific continuity between the 2 crimes, reinforcing the seriousness of the threat. By the mid-1990s, the canal murders represented one of the most troubling unsolved investigations in Phoenix. The connection between Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas was no longer in question. What remained unanswered was the identity of the person whose biological signature tied the attacks together. The investigative foundation had been strengthened, but the path to identification still depended on tools and information not yet available. As the mid-1990s passed, the investigation entered a prolonged stretch without arrest. Detectives had confirmed that Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas were killed by the same individual, yet identification remained beyond reach. Evidence existed and a DNA profile had been developed, but there was no name to attach to it. Phoenix police continued to review the file periodically. Leads generated in earlier years were re-examined. Names that had surfaced during canvassing were compared again against available information. Detectives submitted the unknown DNA profile into developing databases as those systems expanded. Each time a new offender sample was entered into state or national registries, there remained the possibility of a match. No hit occurred. The lack of progress did not mean inactivity, but the pace slowed compared to the immediate aftermath of the murders. Investigators balanced current cases with unresolved files. The canal murders remained open, yet without new evidence or a confession. The path forward depended largely on technology and time. Community memory did not fade as quickly. Families of the victims continued to seek answers. Media outlets occasionally revisited the killings, especially on anniversaries. Public awareness remained, but without identifiable suspects, coverage focused on the enduring mystery rather than developments. During those years, law enforcement procedures regarding DNA collection evolved. Arizona implemented requirements for certain convicted offenders to provide samples for databases. Each legislative change increased the likelihood that an unknown profile could eventually match someone already in custody for another offense. Detectives monitored those updates carefully. At the same time, officers reviewed whether additional crimes might be linked. Reports of assaults along canals or similar environments were compared against the existing profile. Investigators remained cautious not to attach unrelated incidents without forensic confirmation. Maintaining accuracy was essential to preserving credibility and protecting future prosecutions. Preservation of physical evidence became a central responsibility. Biological material collected in 1992 and 1993 was stored under controlled conditions. Proper retention ensured that if improved testing methods emerged, samples could be retested. Chain of custody documentation was maintained to protect admissibility in court. The absence of resolution extended across decades. Detectives assigned to the original investigation retired or moved to other units. Knowledge was transferred through reports rather than personal recollection. Institutional continuity relied on written records and preserved materials. The canal system itself continued to operate as part of daily life in Phoenix. While patrols and public awareness increased after the murders, the physical environment remained largely unchanged. For many residents, the killings became part of local history, unresolved but not forgotten. By the early 2000s, advances in forensic science began offering new possibilities. Improved DNA analysis techniques allowed for more sensitive testing and better comparison tools. Investigators periodically reassessed whether the preserved evidence could benefit from updated methods. Each reassessment required resources and prioritization decisions within the department. Through these years, the central fact remained consistent. A single unidentified individual had left biological evidence linking him to 2 violent killings. The identity attached to that profile remained unknown. The file endured, sustained by careful preservation and the understanding that future scientific progress might succeed where earlier efforts could not. The investigation did not close. It waited. As the 2 canal murders remained unresolved through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, the most important asset investigators retained was biological evidence. From the beginning, forensic technicians had preserved samples collected from both crime scenes. At the time of the killings, DNA technology allowed profiling, but database comparison systems were limited and offender submission laws were still expanding. That limitation gradually changed. Arizona strengthened requirements for convicted offenders to submit DNA samples. The development of state and national databases increased the potential for matches. The unknown profile linked to Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas was entered into available systems. Each expansion of the database created another opportunity for identification. Still, no match appeared. Advancements in laboratory science continued. Techniques became more sensitive. Analysts could extract profiles from smaller quantities of biological material. Improvements in amplification processes increased reliability. Investigators monitored these developments and periodically reassessed whether additional testing could provide further clarity. By the early 2000s, Phoenix police had already confirmed that the same individual was responsible for both murders. The DNA link between the 2 scenes was established. What remained missing was a name. The preserved material represented a direct connection to the offender, but only if a matching sample could be found. Detectives reviewed the file as new forensic methods emerged. Evidence custodians confirmed that samples had been maintained under proper storage conditions. Chain of custody records were intact. The quality of preservation ensured that retesting could occur without compromising admissibility in court. As DNA databases grew, Investigators rechecked the canal murder's profile against updated entries. Each time new offenders were required to submit samples, the system automatically compared profiles. The absence of a match suggested that the person responsible had either not been convicted of qualifying offenses or had not yet been required to provide DNA. Attention also turned to familial DNA search possibilities. As forensic science advanced nationally, some jurisdictions began exploring partial matches that could indicate a biological relative of an unknown offender. The concept involved identifying similarities between an unknown sample and individuals already in databases. Such strategies required careful legal review and departmental authorization. Within the Phoenix Police Department, the Canal Murders file remained active in a cold case capacity. Detectives assigned to long-term investigations examined whether new tools justified renewed testing. The existence of preserved biological material meant the opportunity remained open. Public awareness resurfaced periodically as technology improved in other high-profile cases across the country. Successful DNA-based identifications in older investigations demonstrated that evidence retained decades earlier could still lead to arrest. Each development reinforced the importance of preservation decisions made in 1992 and 1993. Laboratories reanalyzed stored samples using updated methods. Confirmatory testing strengthened the reliability of the profile. The consistency of results over time supported confidence in the evidence. Prosecutors consulted with investigators regarding admissibility standards and future courtroom presentation should a suspect be identified. The reassessment phase required patience. There was no immediate breakthrough. Instead, incremental improvements increased readiness. Detectives ensured that documentation met contemporary legal requirements. Digital archiving replaced some older storage formats. Records were modernized to facilitate cross-reference with other jurisdictions. The unknown DNA profile remained the central element. It was objective, measurable, and preserved. Unlike witness memory or circumstantial inference, the biological evidence could directly associate an individual with the crimes. The question was not whether the profile existed, but when it would connect to a person. By the early 2020s, the investigative environment had changed significantly from the early 1990s. Databases were larger, laboratory processes were refined. Law enforcement agencies were more accustomed to revisiting long unresolved files using scientific tools that had not existed at the time of the offenses. The Canal Murders investigation stood ready for that shift. The preservation of evidence over 2 decades ensured that once a viable suspect emerged or a database hit occurred, the material would withstand scrutiny. The groundwork laid in the initial investigation and maintained through years of careful storage had positioned the file for potential resolution through science rather than chance. By 2014, the preserved DNA profile from the Canal Murders remained unmatched in offender databases. Detectives assigned to the cold case unit revisited the file once again. Advances in testing methods had increased sensitivity and reliability, and investigators sought renewed comparison against state records. Laboratory analysis confirmed the integrity of the biological profile that linked Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. The evidence had been maintained in proper storage, and updated processing reaffirmed that the same unknown male contributor was present in material collected from both scenes. With the profile confirmed, detectives reviewed individuals whose names had surfaced in earlier investigative efforts but who had not been conclusively excluded. Attention eventually centered on Bryan Patrick Miller. Public records showed that he had lived in Phoenix during the early 1990s and had connections to the canal areas where both victims were found. At the time of the murders, he had not been arrested or charged in connection with the crimes. Years later, however, his name appeared again in law enforcement databases for unrelated matters. Detectives examined whether a lawful basis existed to obtain a DNA sample from Miller for comparison. According to court reporting and law enforcement statements, investigators conducted surveillance and used undercover tactics to secure an item discarded by him that could provide biological material. That sample was submitted for laboratory analysis. The comparison produced a match to the unknown DNA profile from both canal murder scenes. The result indicated that Bryan Patrick Miller was the source of the biological evidence recovered from Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. Laboratory procedures required confirmatory testing to ensure accuracy. Independent verification strengthened the conclusion. With scientific linkage established, detectives prepared for arrest. In January 2015, Phoenix police took Bryan Patrick Miller into custody. Media coverage quickly identified him as the suspected canal killer. Law enforcement officers held a press conference outlining the evidence and confirming that DNA connected him to both murders. Prosecutors filed charges for the killings of Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. Court documents detailed the forensic basis for the arrest. The charges included first-degree murder and sexual assault related to the two incidents. The announcement marked the first time in more than 2 decades that a specific individual had been formally accused. The identification did not rest on witness testimony alone. The central evidence was biological material preserved from 1992 and 1993. The ability to compare that profile with a newly obtained sample demonstrated the cumulative impact of technological advancement and evidence retention. Community reaction reflected both relief and renewed attention. Families of the victims attended court proceedings. Media outlets revisited the history of the investigation, outlining how the crimes had remained unsolved for over 20 years. Law enforcement officials emphasized that the arrest was made possible by the careful preservation of evidence and the application of updated forensic science. Miller's background received scrutiny in public reporting. Articles described aspects of his life and previous interactions with law enforcement, though officials cautioned that the charges related specifically to the canal murders. Prosecutors focused on preparing the case for trial, aware that DNA evidence would face examination in court. The arrest also triggered review whether Miller could be linked to other crimes. Authorities examined unsolved cases in Arizona and other states to determine if similarities existed. Those inquiries required separate evidentiary support and were handled independently from the canal murders prosecution. Pre-trial proceedings began, including hearings regarding admissibility of forensic evidence. Defense attorneys reviewed laboratory methods and chain of custody documentation. Prosecutors prepared to demonstrate that DNA analysis met legal standards and that evidence had been preserved without contamination. For investigators who had maintained the file for decades, the identification represented the result of long-term institutional continuity rather than sudden discovery. The match occurred because biological material had been retained, databases had expanded, and lawful methods allowed comparison. By early 2015, the canal murders investigation shifted from unresolved inquiry to active prosecution. The name attached to the unknown profile transformed decades of documentation into a court case. The DNA that once represented an unanswered question now formed the basis of formal criminal charges against Bryan Patrick Miller. Once laboratory testing confirmed that Bryan Patrick Miller's DNA matched the biological profile recovered from both canal murder scenes, investigators prepared carefully for arrest. Detectives understood that the strength of the prosecution would depend not only on the scientific result, but on demonstrating that every step leading to that result had been conducted lawfully and transparently. Before moving in publicly, Phoenix police conducted surveillance to verify routine patterns and confirm identity. According to court records and reporting, officers arranged an undercover meeting with Miller at a Phoenix restaurant. The objective was not confrontation, but collection. During that interaction, Miller handled items that could later provide biological material. After he left, those objects were secured and sent for forensic testing. Laboratory analysts extracted DNA from the collected material and compared it to the preserved profile associated with Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. The comparison produced a match. Confirmatory procedures were conducted to ensure reliability, including repeated testing and statistical analysis. The probability calculations indicated that the DNA belonged to Miller and matched the contributor identified in both canal cases. Only after verification did authorities execute the arrest. In January 2015, Miller was taken into custody without incident. Law enforcement officials publicly announced that a suspect had been identified through DNA evidence linking him to both 1992 and 1993 killings. Charges filed included first-degree murder and sexual assault related to each victim. At the press conference, investigators emphasized the role of preserved evidence. They explained that biological material collected decades earlier had been maintained properly and re-examined using updated technology. The arrest was presented as the result of long-term evidence retention combined with improved forensic capability. Following arrest, Miller appeared in court for initial proceedings. Prosecutors outlined the DNA connection as the central element of their case. Defense counsel began reviewing discovery materials, including laboratory reports and chain of custody documentation. The court scheduled hearings to address pre-trial matters. Media coverage expanded beyond the immediate arrest. Public reporting referenced aspects of Miller's background, including his participation in costume events where he had referred to himself as a zombie hunter. While that detail generated headlines, prosecutors maintained focus on the forensic linkage and factual evidence connecting him to the Canal murders. Investigators also assessed whether Miller could be associated with other unsolved crimes. Law enforcement agencies reviewed cases with similar characteristics, though any potential connections required separate evidentiary support. Officials were cautious not to extend conclusions beyond the DNA-confirmed linkage to Brosso and Melanie Bernas. Preparation for trial involved revisiting decades-old documentation. Detectives reviewed original reports, photographs, and laboratory submissions from the early 1990s. Evidence custodians verified storage records to ensure continuity. Forensic experts prepared to testify regarding testing procedures, database comparison, and statistical interpretation. Prosecutors anticipated that the defense would challenge laboratory methodology. As a result, independent verification and adherence to scientific standards were essential. The reliability of the DNA evidence would be scrutinized in court. Each procedural detail from collection through analysis needed to withstand examination. Families of the victims attended hearings as the case progressed through pre-trial stages. For them, the arrest represented a shift from uncertainty to formal accountability, though the judicial process was only beginning. The transition from unresolved investigation to active prosecution required patience and procedural discipline. By early 2015, the Canal murders were no longer defined by absence of a suspect. The undercover operation that secured Miller's DNA sample provided the final comparison necessary to connect him directly to preserved biological evidence. With arrest completed and charges filed, the focus moved from identification to adjudication. The decades-long investigation had entered the courtroom, where scientific findings would be evaluated under legal standards and a jury would ultimately determine guilt or innocence. After Bryan Patrick Miller was formally charged in 2015, the investigation shifted fully into the judicial system. What had once been a cold case sustained by preserved evidence now entered a prolonged pre-trial phase shaped by motions, hearings, and procedural review. The focus turned from identifying a suspect to preparing a case that would withstand detailed courtroom examination. At initial appearances, prosecutors outlined the charges of first-degree murder and sexual assault tied to the killings of Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. The state made clear that the prosecution would rely heavily on DNA evidence linking Miller to biological material recovered from both Canal crime scenes. Defense attorneys began reviewing laboratory reports, chain of custody documentation, and investigative records dating back more than 2 decades. Because the crimes occurred in the early 1990s, prosecutors faced the task of presenting evidence gathered under earlier standards in a modern courtroom. Detectives worked with forensic analysts to ensure that preserved samples had been stored correctly and that testing methods met current scientific requirements. Documentation demonstrating continuity of possession became essential to admissibility. The defense challenged aspects of the forensic process. Court filings and reporting indicated scrutiny of how DNA was obtained, how samples were analyzed, and how comparisons were conducted. Hearings addressed whether the evidence met legal thresholds for reliability. Judges evaluated expert testimony concerning laboratory protocols and statistical interpretation. Competency evaluations and mental health assessments also became part of pretrial proceedings. Defense counsel raised questions regarding Miller's psychological condition, which led to delays while evaluations were conducted. The court considered expert findings before determining that the case could proceed. Such evaluations were procedural safeguards rather than determinations of guilt. Scheduling complexities extended the timeline. Motions required review, and both sides prepared for extensive presentation of forensic evidence. The prosecution organized decades of investigative material, while defense attorneys examined possible weaknesses in the chain of custody or analytical methods. The court balanced the need for thorough preparation with the obligation to move toward trial. Media coverage during this period remained active. Reports revisited the history of the Canal murders and the years during which the killings remained unsolved. Public interest intensified as hearings unfolded. Families of the victims attended proceedings and expressed a desire for resolution, though official statements remained focused on legal process rather than commentary. Prosecutors prepared to demonstrate that the DNA profile linking both murders to Miller was consistent, reliable, and statistically significant. Forensic experts would be required to explain testing procedures in clear terms. The defense prepared cross-examination strategies aimed at challenging interpretation or raising doubt about methodology. The pretrial phase also addressed evidentiary boundaries. Judges ruled on what background information could be presented to jurors. Prosecutors concentrated on facts directly related to the Canal murders, while defense counsel sought to limit material they considered prejudicial. These rulings shaped the structure of the upcoming trial. Years passed between arrest and trial. Continuances occurred for various procedural reasons, including motions, expert review, and scheduling considerations. The delay did not alter the central issue, which remained the strength of the forensic linkage. The preserved biological evidence continued to form the foundation of the prosecution. Throughout this period, investigators maintained contact with laboratory personnel to ensure readiness for testimony. Chain of custody documentation was re-examined repeatedly. Any potential gap required clarification before presentation in court. The prosecution understood that the defense would focus on technical precision. By the time the trial approached, the Canal murders investigation had transformed from an unresolved mystery into a structured legal contest. The pretrial proceedings demonstrated how decades-old evidence could be scrutinized under contemporary standards. Scientific analysis, legal argument, and procedural safeguards combined to shape the path forward. The responsibility now rested with the court system. Identification through DNA led to arrest, but conviction required proof beyond reasonable doubt presented before a jury. The careful preparation during pre-trial stages set the framework for the evidentiary battle that would soon unfold in open court. When the trial of Bryan Patrick Miller began in Maricopa County Superior Court, the investigation that started in 1992 entered its most public and scrutinized phase. Prosecutors carried the burden of proving beyond reasonable doubt that Miller was responsible for the murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. The courtroom became the setting where preserved evidence, scientific analysis, and decades of documentation would be examined in detail. Jury selection preceded opening statements. Attorneys questioned potential jurors regarding their views on capital punishment, forensic science, and media coverage. Given the length of time between the crimes and the trial, many prospective jurors were not familiar with the Canal murders, but pre-trial publicity required careful screening to ensure impartiality. Once selected, the jury was instructed on the presumption of innocence and the standard of proof. Opening statements outlined the positions of both sides. Prosecutors presented the narrative of two young women killed along Phoenix canal paths in 1992 and 1993, linked by DNA evidence that remained preserved for decades. The defense indicated that it would challenge the reliability of forensic conclusions and raise issues regarding mental health. The structure of the trial was clear from the outset. Scientific evidence would stand at the center. The prosecution began by presenting witnesses connected to the original crime scenes. Officers described the discovery of Angela Brosso near a canal in November 1992 and the subsequent discovery of Melanie Bernas in September 1993. Medical experts testified regarding cause of death and injuries in clinical language. The court required testimony to remain factual and based on documented findings. Forensic scientists then explained the DNA profile developed from biological material recovered at both scenes. They described how laboratory testing in the 1990s established that the same unknown male contributor was present in samples linked to both victims. Later, in 2014 and 2015, updated testing methods confirmed the profile and allowed comparison with a sample obtained from Miller. Statistical testimony outlined the probability that another unrelated individual would share the same genetic markers. The numbers presented indicated that the match was extremely unlikely to occur by chance. Chain of custody documentation was introduced to demonstrate that evidence collected decades earlier had been stored properly and remained uncontaminated. Analysts detailed procedures for packaging, labeling, and preserving biological material. The continuity of records was emphasized to show that samples tested in modern laboratories were the same materials recovered at the original scenes. The prosecution also introduced evidence describing the undercover operation used to obtain Miller's discarded DNA sample. Officers testified about surveillance and lawful collection methods. Laboratory analysts confirmed that the DNA extracted from that material matched the profile associated with the canal murders. Throughout the presentation, the court maintained structured procedure. Objections were raised and ruled upon. The judge instructed jurors to consider only admitted evidence. Media coverage reported daily developments, but the jurors were directed to avoid outside information. Witnesses connected to the victims also testified about last known movements. Testimony described Angela Brosso leaving her apartment for a bicycle ride and Melanie Bernas traveling toward a convenience store. These accounts provided context without relying on speculation. The prosecution focused on reconstructing events supported by documented evidence. As weeks progressed, jurors reviewed photographs, laboratory reports, and expert testimony. The technical nature of DNA evidence required careful explanation in accessible terms. Prosecutors worked to demonstrate that scientific findings provided direct linkage, while defense counsel prepared to question those interpretations during cross-examination. The trial required balancing historical events with contemporary standards. Evidence collected in 1992 and 1993 was presented under legal frameworks in place decades later. The prosecution emphasized that preservation decisions made early in the investigation allowed the material to meet modern evidentiary requirements. By the conclusion of the state's case, the jury had heard detailed accounts of the canal crime scenes, laboratory analysis, and the process that led to Miller's identification. The courtroom examination transformed preserved biological material into live testimony. The investigation that had endured over 30 years now depended on jurors evaluating whether the evidence presented met the high standard required for conviction under Arizona law. When the trial moved into its evidentiary phase, attention shifted from procedural preparation to contested argument. Prosecutors had presented DNA findings, crime scene documentation, and testimony from investigators who described how preserved biological material linked Bryan Patrick Miller to both canal killings. The defense now focused on challenging interpretation rather than disputing the existence of evidence. Defense attorneys concentrated on the reliability of forensic analysis. Cross-examination questioned laboratory methods, statistical calculations, and potential contamination. Experts were asked to explain how samples collected in the early 1990s had been stored and whether degradation over time could affect results. Prosecutors responded by detailing preservation procedures and confirmatory testing that supported accuracy. A central element of the defense involved Miller's mental health. Court reporting documented that the defense presented evidence related to his psychological condition, including dissociative identity disorder. Attorneys argued that mental illness affected his state of mind. The prosecution countered by emphasizing the consistency of DNA evidence and the structured nature of the attacks. Jurors heard testimony from witnesses connected to the original investigations. Officers described the discovery scenes and the condition of both victims. Medical experts explained injuries in clinical terms. The defense examined these witnesses carefully, probing for inconsistencies or memory gaps given the passage of time. The court reminded jurors that recollection from decades earlier required evaluation alongside documented reports. The prosecution relied heavily on scientific continuity. Forensic specialists described how the same unknown male DNA profile was present in biological material collected from Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. They explained how that profile was later matched to Miller using lawful collection methods. Statistical testimony outlined the probability that another individual could share the same genetic markers. Defense counsel highlighted the absence of eyewitness identification. No person had directly observed the perpetrator at the canal scenes. Attorneys emphasized that the state's argument rested primarily on laboratory findings rather than direct testimony. The prosecution responded that modern forensic science allows identification independent of eyewitness presence. Court proceedings extended over weeks. Jurors were required to absorb complex scientific explanations while also considering emotional weight associated with violent crime. Judges ruled on objections and ensured that questioning remained within legal boundaries. The adversarial structure of the trial required each side to present its strongest interpretation of the same evidence. Media outlets reported daily developments. Coverage focused on expert testimony, the psychological defense, and the presentation of DNA statistics. Families of the victims attended sessions, listening to detailed descriptions of events from 1992 and 1993. The courtroom atmosphere reflected seriousness rather than spectacle. The defense strategy sought to introduce reasonable doubt. Attorneys argued that mental illness could influence interpretation of responsibility, and that forensic processes required scrutiny. The prosecution maintained that the biological evidence was direct and scientifically sound. Each side addressed jurors respectfully while pressing competing narratives. Closing arguments summarized months of testimony. Prosecutors reiterated that preserved DNA from both canal scenes matched Miller and that the probability of misidentification was extremely low. Defense counsel reminded jurors of their obligation to weigh all evidence carefully and consider the standard of proof. Deliberations followed. Jurors reviewed exhibits, testimony transcripts, and forensic reports. The decision would determine whether the decades-long investigation would culminate in conviction or acquittal. The courtroom examination had tested the evidence under adversarial scrutiny. The responsibility now rested with the jury to evaluate whether the prosecution had met its burden beyond reasonable doubt. After weeks of testimony and argument, the jury returned to the courtroom to deliver its decision. In 2022, jurors found Bryan Patrick Miller guilty of the murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. The verdict followed extensive review of forensic evidence, expert testimony, and legal argument presented during trial. The central element remained the DNA profile that linked him to biological material collected from both canal scenes. The guilty finding marked the first formal legal determination in a case that had remained unresolved for 3 decades. Prosecutors had argued that preserved evidence and updated testing methods established identity beyond reasonable doubt. Defense counsel had challenged laboratory interpretation and raised issues related to mental health. Jurors weighed those competing positions and concluded that the state had met its burden. Following conviction, proceedings moved into the penalty phase. Under Arizona law, capital sentencing required additional consideration. The prosecution presented aggravating factors. The defense offered mitigation evidence. Jurors were instructed to evaluate statutory standards before determining punishment. Court reporting detailed the structured nature of the sentencing process. Expert testimony addressed psychological evaluation. Attorneys presented arguments regarding the appropriate penalty under state law. The gravity of the crimes and the passage of time were acknowledged within legal boundaries rather than emotional framing. Ultimately, the jury imposed a sentence of death. The court formally entered judgment reflecting that decision. The ruling concluded the trial phase and shifted the case into post-conviction status. Appeals became part of the process as required in capital cases. Legal review mechanisms were initiated to examine procedural fairness and evidentiary integrity. Families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas were present during sentencing. Public statements reported their reactions in restrained terms, emphasizing relief that accountability had been established. Prosecutors highlighted the role of preserved DNA evidence and the persistence of investigators who maintained the file over decades. Biological material collected in 1992 and 1993 had remained viable and admissible. The conviction rested primarily on scientific linkage rather than eyewitness testimony. Media coverage summarized the historical arc of the Canal murders. Reports revisited the disappearance of two young women, the years without arrest, the eventual DNA identification, and the lengthy trial. The verdict and sentence closed the trial chapter of the investigation, but did not eliminate the procedural steps that follow a capital conviction. The sentencing decision underscored the legal system's layered structure. Identification through science led to arrest. Arrest led to prosecution. Prosecution required proof under adversarial examination. Sentencing required separate deliberation guided by statute. Each stage operated within defined rules. With the jury's decision entered into the record, the Canal murders were no longer unsolved. The verdict provided formal resolution through the court system. The sentence reflected juror assessment of aggravating and mitigating factors under Arizona law. The decades-long investigation concluded in a judgment grounded in preserved evidence and evaluated under contemporary legal standards. Following conviction and sentencing, attention turned to the broader effect the Canal murders had on Phoenix and on the families who had waited decades for resolution. The verdict did not erase the passage of time, but it provided a formal answer within the legal system. Public statements from relatives reflected a sense of relief that accountability had been established after years of uncertainty. Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas had been young women whose lives were part of everyday community activity. Their deaths altered how residents viewed canal paths that had previously been used for recreation and routine travel. In the years immediately following the murders, patrol presence increased and safety awareness campaigns were emphasized. The memory of the crimes remained part of local history, even as the investigation moved through long periods without visible progress. Media coverage after the verdict revisited the timeline from 1992 and 1993 through arrest and trial. Articles summarized the role of preserved DNA evidence and the length of time between the offenses and conviction. The reporting focused on factual developments rather than speculation, highlighting how scientific advances contributed to resolution. Law enforcement officials noted that the investigation reinforced the importance of evidence retention policies. The biological material collected decades earlier had remained viable because it was stored under controlled conditions. That continuity allowed later testing to meet contemporary courtroom standards. Departments across the country cited similar examples in discussing cold case review strategies. The case also contributed to public understanding of how DNA databases function. As laws expanded requiring convicted offenders to submit samples, the potential for matching unknown profiles increased. Although the Canal murders were solved through direct comparison after lawful collection of Miller's DNA, the broader system of database expansion played an essential role in cold case investigations nationwide. Community reflection included recognition of the investigative persistence required over 30 years. Detectives assigned to the file at different stages relied on documentation left by predecessors. Institutional memory depended on careful record-keeping rather than personal recollection. The eventual outcome illustrated how structured procedures can carry a case forward across generations of investigators. Public discussion also addressed the psychological defense presented during trial. Reporting emphasized that jurors evaluated mental health arguments within legal standards and still found the prosecution had met its burden. The process demonstrated that courts consider both forensic science and defense claims before reaching a decision. For the families, the trial provided an opportunity to speak during sentencing proceedings. Their remarks were documented in court coverage and reflected the long impact of the crimes. While legal resolution cannot reverse events, it can acknowledge harm within formal structures of accountability. The Canal murders left a lasting imprint on Phoenix. The path to resolution required advances in forensic science, preservation of evidence, and adherence to procedural safeguards. Community members witnessed how decades-old crimes could still move through the judicial system when documentation remained intact. As the case entered post-conviction review, the public record reflected a completed prosecution supported by scientific evidence and evaluated in court. The story of Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas became part of a broader conversation about cold cases, investigative endurance, and the evolving role of DNA in criminal justice. With conviction and sentencing entered into the record, the Canal murders moved from active prosecution into post-trial review. Appeals became part of the process, as required in capital cases, ensuring that procedural standards were examined at higher judicial levels. The legal system continued its structured oversight even after a jury decision. The investigation demonstrated the long-term value of evidence preservation. Biological material collected in the early 1990s was maintained under controlled conditions for more than 20 years. That decision allowed later testing with improved scientific methods. Without careful storage and documentation, identification would not have been possible. Advances in DNA analysis played a central role. Early testing confirmed linkage between the two Canal crimes, but databases were limited. As laws expanded requiring convicted offenders to submit samples, the possibility of comparison increased. Technological refinement improved sensitivity and reliability. Scientific progress combined with lawful collection of a comparison sample ultimately produced the match that led to arrest. The case also illustrates the structure of criminal procedure. Identification through forensic science does not bypass the need for courtroom scrutiny. Evidence must be presented, challenged, and evaluated under established standards. The adversarial process requires both prosecution and defense to test reliability. Only after that examination can a verdict be rendered. For the families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas, the outcome represented formal acknowledgement of responsibility. The legal resolution did not change what occurred in 1992 and 1993, but it established accountability within the framework of law. The passage of time did not eliminate the possibility of prosecution when evidence remained intact. Community impact extended beyond the courtroom. The Canal murders influenced public awareness regarding safety along recreational paths. They also reinforced the importance of legislative measures that expanded DNA collection and database development. Each procedural improvement increased the likelihood that preserved evidence could later identify offenders in other investigations. Institutional continuity proved critical. Detectives who first worked the scenes documented findings carefully. Evidence custodians maintained storage standards. Later investigators revisited the file when technology evolved. The resolution depended on decades of professional record-keeping rather than sudden discovery. The Canal murders investigation underscores that unresolved crimes can remain viable when evidence is preserved and reviewed systematically. Scientific patience, procedural discipline, and legal safeguards together shaped the path from unsolved investigation to conviction. Accountability was achieved through documented proof and judicial process, rather than speculation or assumption. The story concludes not with dramatic closure, but with confirmation that preserved evidence and sustained institutional responsibility can withstand time. The legal system addressed the crimes through structured evaluation. The record now reflects a completed prosecution grounded in forensic science and tested in court.